Everyone has some sort of misstep in their career. No one has a perfect career at all. Everyone has a moment or two or dozen of old shames, creator backlashes, creator apathy, or a period of something called a dork age, which is when someone goes through a while where they just aren't good at what they do best or they're just subpar. Careers have always been a source of interest, especially when one is well known. Look at any popular actor, musician, author, anyone popular, or at the very least, someone you look up to, and they have had stumbles along the way. Whether it happened at the beginning of their career or when they're on the downturn of their career, there will always be a stumble of some sort. It is very rare for a career to have no blemishes, and there are times when those blemishes would affect the rest of their career. But it doesn't always have to be for long, since people love a good career resurrection. Look at Robert Downey Jr., Matthew McConaughey, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. Very talented, with a dip in their careers, and they come back in a bigger and better way. But very occasionally, there will be a career resurrection that will be flawed. In fact, all career resurrections start off shaky. Something will be released that will be considered not so great, but it is a start to better things. The first video essay I made on this channel was when I discussed the interesting failure of Encore. I talked about what was going on with Eminem during this period of time, and how it was the start of a dark period in his career. Drug addiction, depression, nearly dying at one point, but I wanted to talk about his career resurrection at some point. Now, everyone says that his album Recovery is the point where Marshall got his groove back, and that is a fair assessment. It showed his voice was never weak, he always had that fire, and he didn't always have to be that jokey, controversial person, but rather, a voice that could be comforting at times, something that could pull one out of the fire. Now, Recovery could be the full-on resurrection of his career, but I want to talk about the album that, in hindsight, was needed for a career resurrection. Relapse, which was the complete opposite of what Recovery would become. The title alone suggests that he's going back to his old ways, that he's trying to be that person he tried to be in Encore. The album is pretty much the hostile takeover of Slim Shady. He's trying to go back to familiar territory. However, things have changed in the musical landscape. Between his Encore and Relapse albums, the hip-hop scene had changed. There had been a lot more focus on music being lighter and softer in the situation. People like Lil Wayne and Kanye West were consistently making albums that had cultivated to a mass appeal, to which even Mathers said that he had a little bit of envy toward them, because while they were working hard at doing what they did best, he sat on the sidelines doing nothing. In 2003, this album could have been fine, but the edginess of this album made it stand out, and not really for the best. When Eminem released an album, there was hype, but when Relapse came out, it was a little bit more muted. Whether you think it was a stumbling block, whether it was too long between albums, either way, Relapse seemed like a relic of its time when it was released at the last part of the decade. But Relapse is unique because it stands out. Eminem is back in the game and he's doing something he has not done in a long while. This is a horrorcore album, something that he hasn't done since the Marshall Mathers LP. The Eminem Show was him still having his crazy side, but he's clearly reaching maturity. Encore was mostly apathetic. Now, releasing this type of album in this time period is rather risky. The Marshall Mathers LP was released at a time when there were darker types of music out there, like nu metal and rap rock, but at the time, releasing hardcore music in the early 2000s was considered pretty normal. But releasing a horrorcore album in a changing landscape in the last part of the 2000s is really risky. The question in this video is, why was Relapse needed? Well, let's look at the definition of the album title. Relapse is a deterioration of someone's state of health after a temporary improvement. This is significant because Mathers was still working on sobriety, but his music was planned to be crazier and weirder than usual. In fact, the album seems to do everything to ensure that the Slim Shady persona was in quote, top form. With the amount of bizarre humor and the accents that tended to get overused to the point of tiring, this album is him taking his weirdest qualities and dialing them up to 11. He described the concept behind this album as rapping as if he was on drugs again. In other words, this album was needed for his sake. This seems less like something he would do for a massive audience as much as it's for himself. Relapse is his cathartic release. Mathers released this album just to flush out a lot of the immature qualities that he had kept in his back pocket for the long hiatus. This album is more of a vent for him that just so happens to revolve around horror, drug rehab, and of course, relapse. And there were people who didn't get why this album was so weird and inconsistent at times. Well, this is the sort of thing that would happen to anybody. Imagine you want to make a promise, whether it's for a New Year's resolution, or a promise to someone, or wanting to start a new chapter in your life. In some way you want to change something about yourself, so you have to leave something behind, even for a little while. So what does one do before giving something up? They dive straight into their vices one last time, binging like there is no tomorrow, not caring about what happens in the future, but what will happen now. You are getting all the worst qualities of yourself out of your system, just getting everything out before you go into a future of struggles, relapse, and maybe a promising beginning of a new chapter. Everyone has been through this at some point in their lives. It doesn't have to be drugs and alcohol. It could be junk food, excessive shopping, depression by choice. There is a very long list. Eminem's vices having Slim taking over most of the album and letting his alter ego let loose with his dark comedic songs that pole dance over the line between tasteless and hilarious. Yes, this album favors one side of Eminem for the most part, but then again, this is an album that is just a cathartic release for Marshall to do before going to other projects. And yet, in this crazy energy, the album ended up having a moment of maturity and would be foreshadowing his next album. The song Beautiful ended up being the final single off the album. It talks about how isolated he was after his encore album cycle, and how he feels like he is a sad clown. He wants to be taken seriously. However, there are people who only think of him as this dark, comedic, self-deprecating character, but nothing else more. After all of the insane, off-the-wall songs off of Relapse, it goes to show that despite all that, there is a human quality to the rapper with a darker alter ego. This song represents the human side, a depressing side, a side that is afraid to be shown unless it's written in a journal. This goes to show that everyone is human no matter who they are. Craziness aside, there is a vulnerability to this album. Nothing new from Eminem, but it goes to show that he clearly was not done yet. In conclusion, is Relapse a great album? Not really. Is it a good step forward? Yes. It is a flawed album, but what step forward isn't flawed? After all that had happened to him between albums, it's surprising that he has released an album that is more coherent than Encore, but it is a start. What's a few stumbles when you learn to walk before you run? This is Eminem's stumbling block. It's an album that has a few moments of getting on the exercise bike again and getting back into shape, except it's clear that there's going to be a very long road to recovery. But thankfully, this album has been vindicated by history, and people have started to take notice of this overlooked album. It's no Eminem show, it's no Marshall Mathers LP, but it's not supposed to be. It's an album filled with dusty webs, but that makes you realize the mistakes and do better next time, because that is how life is.